In March 2006, an ordinary day on a construction site turned into a chilling discovery that would unravel a web of corruption and mystery. A worker, clearing debris at the Riverside Casino, came across something buried deep in the foundation, human remains wrapped in deteriorating plastic. But it wasn't just the body that made this discovery shocking. It was the badge, partially visible, and unmistakably belonging to FBI Special Agent David Torino, the very agent who had vanished without a trace in 1998 while investigating organized crime ties to the casino. What had happened to Torino? Who knew where to hide him for years? And what was waiting to be uncovered about the casino and the men connected to it? This discovery didn't just bring answers. It sparked a dangerous investigation that would unearth secrets many tried to bury forever. If you want to know how this chilling discovery uncovered one of the darkest conspiracy stories ever, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video. You don't want to miss the full story. It was a typical March morning when the call came through to Detective Vincent Caldwell. A construction worker had stumbled upon something in the foundation of the Riverside Casino, something that shouldn't be there. Caldwell had worked cases like this before, but this one felt different. He grabbed his jacket and badge, heading to the site with a sense of urgency. What was hidden beneath the concrete slab? The Riverside Casino had been closed for renovation, part of a major expansion. The project had been going on for 6 months, but the foundation had been built nearly a decade ago. What secrets had it kept? The worker's voice crackled over the phone. "Detective, you need to get down here. We found something buried in the foundation." Caldwell's gut tightened. He had no idea what he was about to uncover. 20 minutes later, Caldwell arrived at the site. The air was cold, and the construction equipment hummed in the background. Workers were busy clearing debris from a cracked section of the old foundation. Jake Morrison, the construction supervisor, approached him, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. "We were breaking up the concrete," he explained, "and when it cracked differently than expected, we found this." Morrison led Caldwell to the cracked concrete where the workers had already cleared a path. A hole about 3 feet deep revealed the wrapped outline of what looked like a body. The smell was unmistakable. Caldwell's heart raced. He crouched down, noticing the metal gleam beneath the plastic covering. "That's a badge," he muttered to himself, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He knew that badge. Without hesitation, Caldwell ordered, "Nobody touch anything else. I'm calling in the crime scene unit." Within the hour, the site was swarming with technicians, medical examiners, and crime scene specialists, all ready to begin their work. As the technicians carefully unwrapped the remains, Caldwell's worst fears were confirmed. It was the body of FBI Special Agent David Torino. Torino had disappeared 8 years earlier while investigating organized crime links to the casinos. The realization hit Caldwell like a punch to the stomach. Torino had been investigating money laundering operations at the casino before he vanished. Now Caldwell understood why Torino had never been found. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide him. Dr. Patrick Hriss, the medical examiner, began the initial examination. He was buried in a deliberately excavated section of the foundation, he noted. Fresh concrete covered him after the body was placed here. Someone with access did this. Caldwell's mind raced. The concrete around the body had been poured on September 18, 1998, just days after Torino had disappeared. The timing was no coincidence. The man who had vanished was now found, right under the casino's foundations. "Who was the original construction company?" Caldwell asked Morrison, needing to know every detail. "Brennan Brothers Construction," Morrison answered. "They handled everything from 97 to 99. The work was extensive, but I don't think they had any problems." The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. Torino had been investigating the Riverside Casino as part of a larger probe into organized crime. It was clear someone involved in the casino had played a direct role in his disappearance. As Caldwell stood over Torino's remains, he felt a surge of determination. This discovery had just reopened a case thought to be closed for good. Torino's body had been hidden here for years, and Caldwell was determined to find out why. He quickly called in Special Agent Rachel Martinez from the St. Louis FBI field office. She had worked on the original Torino investigation, and she needed to know about the breakthrough. "We found Torino," Caldwell told her, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. Martinez's response was immediate. "Where?" she asked, a mixture of disbelief and urgency in her voice. "Buried in the foundation of the Riverside Casino," Caldwell replied. "I'm driving down there now. Don't let anyone near that scene." As Caldwell waited for Martinez to arrive, he reviewed everything he knew about the Torino case. The agent had been investigating money laundering at the casino, uncovering patterns of suspicious cash transactions that tied the casino to organized crime families. Torino had been closing in on key figures when he disappeared. He had developed sources inside the casino and was set to make arrests. His sudden disappearance had left the investigation dead in its tracks. Now there was hope. As the sun began to set over the Missouri River, Caldwell's mind was spinning. The case that had gone cold for 8 years was alive again, and the discovery at the Riverside Casino was just the beginning of something much bigger. The next morning, Detective Caldwell met Special Agent Rachel Martinez at the FBI office in St. Louis. They sat across from each other, their minds focused on one thing: uncovering who killed David Torino. Martinez had been one of the lead agents on the Torino case when he vanished. Now, 8 years later, the case had reappeared, and with it, a new, deadly twist. Torino was dead, but why? The pair pored over old case files, re-examining Torino's investigation into the Riverside Casino. The casino's financial records revealed millions of dollars in suspicious transactions, money laundering disguised as legitimate gambling revenue. Martinez slid a folder across the table to Caldwell. "This is the profile of Anthony Velasco, the casino's general manager," she explained. "He was the key suspect in Torino's investigation. If Torino was close to exposing him, Velasco would have had a motive to act." Caldwell studied the file closely. Velasco's connections to organized crime families from Chicago and Kansas City were well documented. Torino had been following a trail of dirty money, and Velasco seemed to be at the heart of it all. "Velasco knew Torino was getting close," Caldwell muttered, his eyes narrowing. "He must have feared the walls closing in on him, and then Torino disappeared. We need to find out who else knew Torino was onto him." They continued to pore through the files, focusing on the timeline of Torino's last days. He had been staying at the Riverside Inn, and his last contact had been with an informant, someone tied to Velasco's operations. Martinez's voice broke through Caldwell's thoughts. "We need to find out who this informant was." Torino believed they had evidence of money laundering at the casino, and this meeting was supposed to be the key to cracking the case wide open. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The more he read, the more the pieces fell into place. Someone inside the casino or law enforcement had been feeding information to Velasco's network. As the day wore on, they made calls to their contacts in the casino industry, trying to piece together who had worked closely with Velasco and who might have had access to the details of Torino's investigation. Caldwell's phone rang just as he was about to leave. It was Jake Morrison, the construction supervisor who had found Torino's body. "Detective, we found something else. You need to come back to the casino." Caldwell exchanged a glance with Martinez, then grabbed his jacket. "Let's go," he said. They headed straight to the Riverside Casino, eager to follow up on Morrison's discovery. What else had they missed? When they arrived at the casino, Morrison led them to the basement area where they had found the body. It seemed as though someone had tampered with the security systems there during the original construction phase. The records show that the basement was accessed several times after hours, Morrison said, his brow furrowing. But none of the security logs match up. It's as if someone erased the records, like they didn't want us to know who was there. Caldwell's instincts kicked in. "Who had access to the basement during construction?" he asked. Morrison pointed to a list of names, which included several key employees: Velasco, the security head, and even some of the subcontractors who had worked on the foundation. "That's a lot of people," Caldwell muttered. "But not everyone would have known about Torino's investigation. We need to focus on the ones who had both access and motive to silence him." Martinez picked up on the same thought. "We're looking at an inside job, someone close to the casino's operations, someone with knowledge of Torino's investigation, and someone who could have orchestrated his disappearance." The list of suspects was growing, but Caldwell knew they needed more concrete evidence to connect the dots. They needed a breakthrough, something to tie the men at the casino directly to Torino's murder. As they walked through the casino, Caldwell couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The investigation was becoming more dangerous by the minute. There were powerful forces at play, and they were closing in on the truth. Back at the office, they reviewed surveillance footage from the night Torino had disappeared. They saw him entering the casino parking lot, but after that, nothing. The security system had conveniently malfunctioned that night, erasing any footage from after 7:15 p.m. "Someone knew exactly what they were doing," Martinez said, frustration in her voice. "They didn't just kill Torino, they went to great lengths to make it look like he'd disappeared on his own." Caldwell ran his fingers through his hair. "We need to dig deeper into the casino's security. What if the system was deliberately tampered with to protect someone? What if that someone was Velasco or his associates?" They planned their next move. Caldwell and Martinez would visit the casino's security office and speak with Thomas Brennan, the head of security. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. Someone was trying to bury Torino's investigation, and it wasn't going to be easy to dig it back up. The next morning, Caldwell and Martinez made their way to the Riverside Casino. The investigation was beginning to gain momentum, but they both knew there were still plenty of dangerous gaps to close. As they walked through the casino's bustling lobby, Caldwell couldn't help but feel the weight of the task ahead. The casino was the epicenter of the entire investigation. Every lead seemed to tie back here. Martinez spoke quietly. "We know that Velasco was central to the money laundering operation, but it goes beyond him. The whole casino was built around this illicit activity, and we need to expose it." Caldwell nodded, his eyes scanning the familiar environment. The Riverside Casino wasn't just a popular gambling destination. It was a front for an elaborate operation, and behind its flashing lights, secrets were hidden in every corner. The pair arrived at the security office. Thomas Brennan, the head of security, was a tall man with a commanding presence. He greeted them coolly, but Caldwell knew he'd been involved in something much darker than routine security. "Mr. Brennan," Caldwell began, "we're looking into some irregularities in your security system from 1998, the night Agent Torino disappeared. Can you explain why the footage from that evening was deleted?" Brennan's expression remained neutral. "There was a power surge that night," he said, "and the system malfunctioned. It's not unusual for older equipment to fail under stress." Caldwell wasn't convinced. Something about Brennan's tone felt rehearsed. Martinez pressed further. "The malfunction only affected that night, and only during the crucial time Torino was on site. That's a bit too convenient, don't you think?" Brennan shifted uncomfortably. "It's just a coincidence," he insisted, but his eyes betrayed his nervousness. Caldwell knew Brennan was hiding something big, but for now he had to play it cool. "Let's talk about the basement," Caldwell said. "You were in charge of security during the renovation. Was there anyone who had unauthorized access to the lower levels, especially after hours?" Brennan's face tightened. "I don't know what you're implying, Detective. The basement was secured and only approved personnel were allowed down there. If anyone had access, it would have been on the books." Caldwell could feel the tension rising. "We know the records are incomplete. There were after-hours visits to the basement that weren't logged. Care to explain that?" Brennan's eyes darted to the side, and Caldwell noticed the flicker of panic in his gaze. "That's not something I was aware of," he said quickly, his voice strained. "If you think someone was tampering with the logs, I can't say anything about it." Martinez stepped forward. "We know there were several key figures working at the casino who had access to the security systems. We need to know who those people were, Brennan. Who could have altered the logs?" Brennan hesitated, looking around as if searching for an escape. "I can't name names," he muttered, "but you're barking up the wrong tree. This is bigger than you realize." Caldwell leaned in, his voice low. "Listen, Brennan, you're going to help us. We know Torino's investigation was closing in on something massive here. You've been part of it, and you're going to give us something useful." Brennan's face paled, and for a moment he looked as if he might break, but instead he straightened up, his resolve returning. "I've already said too much. You won't get anything else from me." Caldwell and Martinez exchanged a look. It was clear that Brennan wasn't going to crack easily, but they now knew that he had been part of something much larger, a conspiracy that reached deep into the heart of the casino. "We'll be back," Caldwell said coldly. "Don't think for a second that we're done here." As they left the security office, Caldwell felt a growing sense of urgency. The walls were closing in on Velasco and his associates, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things were becoming. Martinez spoke up as they walked through the casino floor. "Brennan's not the only one with something to hide. The entire operation has layers. We need to dig into Velasco's connections, find out who else is pulling strings." Caldwell nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd of gamblers and dealers. The casino was a front for something much more sinister, and they had to expose it before anyone else got hurt. The next step was clear. They needed to focus on Velasco's network. Caldwell pulled out his phone and called an old contact in the Gaming Commission. They needed to know more about Velasco's dealings outside the casino. By the time they left the casino, Caldwell had a few names in mind. Key players who could shed light on the criminal web surrounding the operation. They were going to need a lot more than gut instinct to crack this case wide open. Caldwell was more determined than ever to get to the bottom of it. Torino had been murdered to protect a vast criminal empire, and Caldwell wasn't about to let that happen again. As they left the Riverside Casino, Martinez turned to Caldwell. "The deeper we go, the more dangerous this becomes, but I think we're getting close. We're on the right track." Caldwell clenched his jaw. He knew she was right, but he also knew that there were powerful men out there who wouldn't hesitate to bury him and Martinez if it meant protecting their secrets. As Caldwell and Martinez delved deeper into the casino's operations, the more it became clear that the conspiracy was not just limited to a few individuals. It reached higher, spreading across law enforcement and beyond. Their investigation pointed to a network of men within the casino, employees, contractors, and associates, who had all been working in tandem to cover up Torino's murder. But who was orchestrating it all? The names of key figures started to surface: Anthony Velasco, Thomas Brennan, and even a few others with ties to powerful crime families. Caldwell knew these men had deep connections, and they wouldn't go down easily. The corruption seemed to run through every level of the casino, from the high-stakes poker tables to the back offices. Caldwell's gut told him that these men weren't just criminals. They were protected by a much larger, more dangerous force. They turned their attention to the financials of the casino. Caldwell had learned that Velasco had been funneling money through a complex system of shell companies and offshore accounts. Someone had to be covering his tracks. Caldwell and Martinez met with an old informant who had worked at the casino. The man, once a dealer, had left the industry after growing suspicious of the operations he had witnessed. He agreed to talk, reluctantly. "I knew something was off," the informant said, his voice shaking. "But when Torino started asking questions, that's when things started to get dangerous. They started taking out anyone who got too close." The informant revealed that Velasco had been meeting with high-ranking officials outside the casino, including men who were well known in organized crime. These meetings, often held under the cover of high-stakes games, were not just about money. "We're talking about real power," the informant continued. "These men aren't just running casinos. They're involved in everything: drug trade, protection rackets, even political corruption. They'll do whatever it takes to keep it all under wraps." The more Caldwell and Martinez learned, the clearer it became. Torino's death had been part of a larger plan to stop an investigation into a vast criminal enterprise. Velasco had to know Torino was close to exposing everything. But who else was involved? Caldwell's mind raced as they connected the dots. They began to suspect that certain law enforcement officials had been compromised, feeding information to the criminal network in exchange for a cut of the profits. Caldwell was no stranger to corruption within law enforcement, but this felt different. These men weren't just taking bribes. They were actively protecting the criminal empire, hiding evidence, and covering up murder. Their investigation took them to a key meeting that Torino had scheduled before his disappearance. It was set for September 16, 1998, in a private room at the Riverside Casino. Caldwell had to know who Torino was meeting. The meeting had been scheduled with one of Velasco's trusted associates. This was the breakthrough they needed. If they could track down the people involved in this meeting, they might finally have a way to bring Velasco down. As Caldwell reviewed the surveillance footage from the casino, he saw Torino enter the casino alone. He didn't leave, however. The footage ended just after he entered the casino at 7:15 p.m., and there was no further record of him leaving. That evening, they met with the casino's former head of security, a man who had since moved on to other businesses but still had deep ties to the operation. He was reluctant to speak, but Caldwell knew how to press. "You're sitting on information that could bring down an entire criminal enterprise," Caldwell said, his voice firm. "You know who was responsible for deleting the security footage and covering up Torino's murder. You need to talk." The man's face paled, but he didn't immediately speak. Caldwell pressed harder, reminding him that the consequences of staying silent could be just as dangerous as talking. Finally, the man relented, naming names. "I wasn't directly involved," he said, "but I know Brennan was, and Velasco was pulling the strings from the start. He had someone on the inside, someone within the FBI, feeding him information about Torino's investigation." Caldwell felt a chill run down his spine. The conspiracy ran deeper than they had imagined. There was someone within law enforcement working with Velasco. But who? And how deep did the corruption really go? As the hours passed, Caldwell and Martinez tracked down the names of men connected to Velasco. Their next move was clear. They needed to get to Velasco himself. But getting to him would mean crossing a line, one they couldn't turn back from. Martinez spoke quietly. "This is it, Caldwell. We're close. But if we go after Velasco, we're going to make enemies that we can't even imagine. You ready for that?" Caldwell didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice. We've come this far. If we back down now, Torino's death will be for nothing. Let's bring these men to justice, no matter the cost." As Caldwell and Martinez prepared for their next move, the investigation took an even darker turn. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that there were powerful forces at play, manipulating events from the shadows. Caldwell couldn't shake the feeling that someone inside law enforcement was tipping off Velasco. It wasn't just the deleted security footage. It was the way the entire investigation seemed to stall at crucial moments every time they got too close. They reviewed the details of Torino's investigation, searching for any sign of compromise. Torino had been closing in on high-level criminals when he disappeared, and the fact that his investigation had been derailed suggested that someone had intervened. Martinez pulled up a list of FBI personnel who had been assigned to the case in 1998. There were names on that list that Caldwell knew well, and some he didn't recognize at all. Were these men compromised? "We need to look deeper into the FBI itself," Martinez said, her voice low. "If there's a leak, it's likely someone with high-level access, someone who knows Torino's every move, every contact, every decision. Caldwell agreed, but he also knew the danger of poking around inside the bureau. If there was a leak, exposing it could send shockwaves through the entire organization, and that would make powerful enemies. They began by reaching out to former colleagues of Torino's, hoping to find someone who might know if he had any suspicions about the internal leaks. They needed to find the thread that could unravel the whole conspiracy. One of Torino's old partners, Special Agent Greg Taylor, agreed to meet with them. He was a tough, no-nonsense agent who had worked alongside Torino during some of his most dangerous investigations. Caldwell hoped Taylor might provide the answers they needed. Torino was meticulous, Taylor said, taking a seat across from them. He never trusted anyone completely, but there were a few agents he relied on. If there was a leak, it would have been one of them. Taylor's words hit Caldwell like a punch to the gut. If there had been a leak, it meant the conspiracy had likely reached right into the heart of the FBI. Could they really trust anyone inside the bureau? Did Torino ever mention anyone suspicious? Martinez asked, leaning forward. Anyone who might have been giving information to the wrong people? Taylor hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if he were searching through his memories. There was one agent, Wallace Crawford. He was Torino's supervisor on the case. He always seemed too interested in the details of Torino's investigation. Caldwell felt his blood run cold. Wallace Crawford was a well-respected agent, but if he was involved in the leak, it would explain why Torino had been taken out before he could expose the truth. They needed to dig deeper into Crawford's background. They started by reviewing Crawford's work history. On paper, he was a model agent, dedicated, experienced, and trustworthy. But Caldwell knew better than to take things at face value. There had to be something they could uncover. The more they looked into Crawford's past, the more suspicious details began to emerge. His financial record showed an unusual pattern of expenditures, luxury items, expensive trips, and an inconsistent source of income. Was Crawford being paid off? Caldwell turned to Martinez, his face grim. It's all starting to make sense. Crawford was feeding information to Velasco and his associates. But why? What was he getting in return? Martinez pulled up a list of Crawford's known contacts and began to scan through it. We need to find out who Crawford was meeting with. If we can connect him to the right people, we might have enough to bring him down. They contacted an informant who had worked with Crawford in the past. The informant, a former government contractor, was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to speak. He had seen Crawford in meetings with men tied to organized crime. He always seemed to know exactly when the FBI was planning to make a move, the informant said, his voice shaky. Crawford was in deep with those men. He was feeding them intel, letting them know when Torino was getting too close. The revelation hit Caldwell hard. If Crawford had been leaking information to the criminals, it explained why Torino had disappeared. Crawford had been working both sides, helping to protect Velasco and his network while sabotaging the investigation. Caldwell knew they had to act fast. They couldn't afford to let Crawford slip away. He was too connected, too powerful. And if they didn't move quickly, he might disappear just like Torino had. They began gathering evidence to confront Crawford. Every lead, every piece of information they had uncovered pointed back to him. It wasn't just the money or the meetings. It was the way everything had fallen into place once they started looking at him. But as they closed in on Crawford, Caldwell couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. This wasn't just a simple case of corruption. It was a well-planned, coordinated effort to silence anyone who threatened the criminal network. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. Crawford wasn't the only one involved in this web of corruption. There were others, agents, officials, and men with ties to organized crime who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Martinez turned to Caldwell, her voice filled with resolve. We're going to bring Crawford down, but we need to be careful. There are more people involved in this than we know. We can't take any chances. Caldwell nodded, his mind already racing through the next steps. They were getting closer to the truth, But with every piece of the puzzle they uncovered, the stakes grew higher. They had to move quickly, before Crawford or anyone else could make their next move. As Caldwell and Martinez prepared to confront Wallace Crawford, they knew their next steps would lead them into treacherous territory. Crawford had been involved in the conspiracy from the start, and now he was their primary target. Crawford had always been a well-respected agent, his reputation spotless, but Caldwell had learned long ago not to trust appearances. The deeper they dug, the more Crawford's involvement seemed undeniable. They knew they needed to catch Crawford in the act, to gather irrefutable evidence before making a move. But Crawford was a seasoned professional, and Caldwell couldn't afford to make a mistake now. "Crawford's not going to go down without a fight," Martinez said, her voice tense. "He's been working with organized crime for years. He'll do whatever it takes to protect himself, and that means eliminating anyone who threatens him," Caldwell agreed. "If we're going to take him down, we need to be one step ahead. We need to gather all the evidence we can before we confront him. He won't hesitate to destroy us." They set up surveillance around Crawford's known locations, hoping to catch him meeting with his criminal associates. Every lead, every contact pointed back to him. But Caldwell knew it wouldn't be easy to pin him down. As they monitored Crawford's movements, Caldwell couldn't help but wonder how many others were involved. Crawford was just the tip of the iceberg. There were men in positions of power, within the casino, law enforcement, and beyond, who had helped cover up Torino's murder. They discovered that Crawford had been in contact with high-level figures from Chicago's crime families. These were men with deep roots in organized crime, and they weren't going to let Crawford fall without a fight. With every passing day, the investigation grew more dangerous. Caldwell and Martinez had already seen how far these men were willing to go to protect their secrets. The conspiracy ran deep, and exposing it would put them in the crosshairs. Caldwell's thoughts were interrupted when a new lead came in. A former associate of Velasco's had agreed to talk. The man, once a trusted part of Velasco's inner circle, had been watching the investigation unfold from the shadows. "I know things," the man said, his voice shaky over the phone. "I can't do this anymore. Velasco is behind Torino's death, but Crawford, he's the one who covered it up. He's been working both sides for years." The man agreed to meet Caldwell and Martinez in a secluded area. They weren't sure if this was a trap, but it was the best lead they'd gotten in days. They couldn't afford to ignore it. When they arrived, the man was waiting. His face was pale, and his hands trembled. "I didn't think anyone would come after me," he said. "But if you're serious about bringing Velasco and Crawford down, I'll help. I'll tell you everything." Caldwell leaned in, his voice low. "You're doing the right thing. We need to know what you know. The entire network is at risk, and if you're involved, you're just as much a target as we are." The man nodded and started talking. He revealed details of a secret meeting between Crawford and Velasco that had taken place just weeks before Torino's disappearance. It was clear that they had been planning something that would involve eliminating anyone who could expose them. "They knew Torino was close," the informant continued. "Crawford made it clear. He told Velasco that the FBI was about to make moves. That's when they decided to take Torino out of the picture." Caldwell's mind raced. The meeting was a turning point. If Crawford had been informing Velasco about FBI plans, then it explained how they always seemed to stay one step ahead. But it also meant that Crawford was actively sabotaging the investigation. "Where was this meeting held?" Caldwell asked urgently. "What else did they talk about?" The informant hesitated. "They met at the Sunset Shores Casino. It's a smaller operation, but it's tied to Velasco's network. They talked about making Torino disappear. They knew he was getting too close." Martinez looked at Caldwell. "This is huge. We need to move on the Sunset Shores Casino. If we can tie Crawford to that meeting, we can bring him down." Caldwell nodded. "We don't have much time. We need to move fast before Crawford gets wind of what we're doing." They set their sights on the Sunset Shores Casino. It was less guarded than the Riverside, but it still had ties to the same criminal network. If they could connect the dots between Crawford, Velasco, and this meeting, it would be a game changer. Caldwell's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing. It was a message from Martinez. Crawford just left his house. He's heading toward Sunset Shores. Caldwell's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The confrontation was imminent. They quickly gathered their team and headed to the casino, knowing this could be the break they had been waiting for. The stakes had never been higher. They had one shot to take down Crawford and bring justice to Torino. As Caldwell and Martinez neared Sunset Shores Casino, the tension in the air was palpable. They had waited for this moment for months. Crawford's involvement was undeniable, and now they were finally closing in. Caldwell's thoughts raced. The casino was heavily guarded, but they had to move fast. If Crawford was meeting Velasco or his associates there, they needed concrete evidence to bring them down before they slipped away again. Martinez glanced at Caldwell, her expression determined. "This is it. We've got one shot at this. If we make the wrong move, Crawford will vanish, and Velasco will be right behind him." Caldwell nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know, but we've been careful. We've got the informant statements, surveillance footage, and Crawford's connections to Velasco. It's time to put everything on the table." They arrived at the Sunset Shores Casino, its neon lights casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. The building was large, but it wasn't as fortified as the Riverside. Still, they couldn't afford any mistakes. Caldwell turned to Martinez. "We'll split up. I'll take the surveillance room, and you'll go in through the back entrance. We'll cover both angles and meet inside. If we catch Crawford, we bring him in. No hesitation." Martinez nodded, her eyes hard with resolve. "I'll be careful. Let's get this done." As they entered the casino, Caldwell could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were walking into the heart of the operation, the nerve center of a vast criminal empire. Everything hinged on this moment. Caldwell made his way to the security room, where he found 2 guards monitoring the cameras. He flashed his badge and took over the station, quickly bringing up live feeds from all the casino's cameras. He scanned the footage, looking for any sign of Crawford or Velasco. There. Crawford was on the footage, entering the casino's private back rooms. His movements were calculated, as if he knew exactly where he was headed. Martinez, meanwhile, slipped through the back entrance, her senses heightened. She had a clear path to the private rooms where the most dangerous players in the casino network conducted their business. Every step brought her closer to Crawford. Caldwell watched as Crawford made his way down the hallway toward a meeting room. He could almost feel the tension mounting. This was it. If they could catch Crawford in the act, they could expose the entire operation. He signaled to Martinez. "He's heading toward the private meeting room. Move in now. We'll catch him in the act." Martinez nodded, her hand on her sidearm. She moved quickly, silently, her years of training allowing her to blend into the shadows. Every corner of the casino felt like a potential threat. As she approached the meeting room, she could hear voices inside. Crawford's voice was unmistakable. He was talking to someone. But who? Martinez couldn't risk making a sound. She had to get closer. Caldwell watched as Crawford opened the door to the room. There, standing with him, was none other than Anthony Velasco. The 2 men were deep in conversation, discussing something serious. It was clear they didn't realize they were being watched. Martinez, crouched outside the room, could hear fragments of their conversation. Velasco's voice was low, his words laced with venom. "You need to get this under control, Crawford. We can't afford any more mistakes. Torino's death was just the beginning." Caldwell's heart pounded in his chest. This was the proof they needed. Crawford had been working with Velasco all along. Torino had been killed to protect their operation, and now the truth was coming to light. Martinez moved closer, ready to make her move. But just as she was about to step forward, the door creaked. She froze, praying she hadn't been heard. Crawford and Velasco both turned toward the sound, their eyes narrowing. "Who's there?" Crawford barked, his voice filled with suspicion. Martinez had no choice. She stepped into the room, her gun drawn. "It's over, Crawford. You're under arrest." Crawford's face turned pale as he reached for his gun, but Martinez was faster. She fired a shot into the air, the sound ringing through the room. "Drop it," she commanded. "Now!" Velasco's eyes flicked toward the door, his face contorted in fury. "You've made a huge mistake," he spat, but he knew better than to make any sudden movements. Caldwell burst into the room, his own weapon drawn. "It's over, Velasco," Caldwell said, his voice cold. "You're both going down." Crawford and Velasco exchanged a glance, realizing they had been caught. Their plan had unraveled in front of them. Caldwell and Martinez had finally cornered the men responsible for Torino's murder and the corruption that had allowed their empire to thrive. As they cuffed Crawford and Velasco, Caldwell felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The investigation had been long and grueling, but it had paid off. Torino's death would no longer remain a mystery. Justice was finally within reach. But as they walked the two men out of the room, Caldwell couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There were still more people to bring down, more connections to expose, and more lies to unravel. Martinez glanced at Caldwell as they left the casino. "We got them. But this isn't over. The network is bigger than just Velasco and Crawford. We need to keep going." Caldwell nodded grimly. "I know. But today we've made a dent in it, and that's enough for now." As they left the casino, Caldwell felt the weight of everything that had happened. They had brought down two of the biggest players, but the war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Caldwell and Martinez drove away from the Sunset Shores casino, the weight of their recent success settled over them. They had finally captured Velasco and Crawford, but something about it didn't feel complete. Caldwell glanced at Martinez, her expression hard but satisfied. "We've done the right thing. Torino's case is closed, and the criminals responsible for his death are behind bars." Martinez nodded, but there was a hint of unease in her eyes. "It's not just about getting them off the streets. It's about making sure the entire network gets exposed. We can't stop here." Caldwell felt the same. Though the arrests were a victory, he knew the criminal network was vast, with deep roots in both organized crime and law enforcement. There was still more to uncover, more people to bring down. They arrived at the FBI office in St. Louis. The building loomed in the distance, its lights shining through the dark night. It felt almost like a sanctuary, a place where they could regroup and plan their next steps. Inside, Caldwell and Martinez briefed their team on the recent arrests. The tension in the room was palpable, but so was a sense of achievement. They had made progress, but there was no time to rest on their laurels. "We've made a dent," Caldwell said, addressing the team. "But this is just the beginning. Velasco and Crawford won't be the only ones we need to take down. We've got to follow the money and the connections." One of the analysts spoke up. "We've already started looking into the financial networks that Velasco and Crawford were tied to. It's complicated, but we're starting to see patterns emerge. There's more to uncover." Caldwell nodded. "Good. We need to expose every part of their operation, every man, every woman, every connection. The public needs to know the full extent of the corruption. It's the only way we can stop it." As the team continued to work, Caldwell and Martinez stepped outside for a moment. The cool night air felt refreshing, but the weight of the case still hung heavy on their shoulders. It wasn't just about bringing criminals to justice. "We've put our lives on the line for this," Martinez said, her voice quiet but resolute. "If we don't finish this, if we don't expose everyone involved, we're just letting them get away with it." Caldwell met her gaze. "I know. We'll finish this. We can't let Torino's death be forgotten, and we can't let the men who killed him go free. Not while there's still work to be done." As they talked, Caldwell couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. The conspiracy was more extensive than they had realized, and if they were going to dismantle it, they had to be prepared for the fallout. Martinez continued. The deeper we go, the more dangerous it gets. There are still people out there who want to keep this quiet. They'll stop at nothing to protect their interests. Caldwell's jaw tightened. They can try. But we've got the evidence, and we've got the law on our side. If they want to fight, they'll get one. They returned to the office and found their team still working, the hum of computers filling the air. Caldwell knew they were in a race against time. The criminals were already planning their next move, and they couldn't afford to let them get away. They focused on tracking down key figures who had remained under the radar, men who had been involved with Velasco and Crawford, but whose names had yet to surface. The connections were complex, but Caldwell knew it was only a matter of time. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, surveillance, and relentless paperwork. Every lead they followed seemed to open up new avenues of corruption, new players to investigate, and new risks to their safety. As they closed in on the last of the key figures, Caldwell and Martinez found themselves facing a moral dilemma. If they went too far, they might expose the full extent of the corruption within the FBI itself, threatening everything they had worked for. Martinez turned to Caldwell late one evening, her face tired but determined. We have to ask ourselves, how far are we willing to go? We're not just going after criminals anymore. We're going after the system. Caldwell didn't hesitate. I'm willing to go as far as it takes. This isn't just about exposing criminals. It's about exposing the system that's been enabling them for years. If we don't do this, who will? The days turned into weeks, and the investigation reached its final stage. They had enough evidence to bring down the remaining members of the network, but they also knew that doing so would have repercussions. The entire structure of law enforcement could be shaken to its core. As they prepared for the final round of arrests, Caldwell received an anonymous tip. The informant claimed to have information that would expose the highest levels of the conspiracy. But meeting with him would be dangerous enough to put their lives at risk. Caldwell knew that if they went after the final pieces of the puzzle, there would be no turning back. It was a choice that could define the rest of their careers. But Torino's death had to mean something. Justice had to prevail. They decided to meet the informant. If they could take down the rest of the network, it would be a victory not just for them, but for everyone who had suffered at the hands of the corrupt system they were trying to expose. The final confrontation was inevitable. Caldwell knew that the criminals involved were prepared to fight back, but as they set the wheels in motion, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end.